HartmannReport.com is a story that those of you who have been longtime listeners to this program are very, very familiar with. I've written several books about corporate personhood over the years, and how corporate personhood, this whole idea of corporations being people, and therefore they're entitled to First Amendment free speech rights, Fourth Amendment privacy rights, 14th Amendment equal protection rights, Fifth Amendment rights to avoid self-incrimination or prevent takings. These were rights that were designed for human beings. And if you ask any lawyer, they'll tell you, well, in 1886, the Supreme Court said that corporations are people, my friend. In fact, the Supreme Court didn't say that. In fact, when I was writing my book about the 14th Amendment, Unequal Protection, and this was back in 2002, as I recall, a friend of mine, or actually my editor's brother-in-law, visited the National Archives in Washington, D.C. on our behalf. At the time, I was in Portland. Maybe I was in Vermont at the time. Anyhow, he visited the National Archives. He lives in D.C. and just pulled the John Chandler Bancroft Davis and Morrison Remick Waite files, which he said were so dusty it looked like nobody had opened them in over 100 years. And John Chandler Bancroft Davis was the clerk of the court in 1886, the Supreme Court, and Morrison Remick Waite was the Chief Justice. And here was a handwritten note from Chief Justice Waite to the clerk saying, we did not address the constitutional issues that were brought before the court in this 1886 case, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. We did not address the constitutional issues. In other words, it's all been a lie. The whole corporate personhood thing, right from the beginning. It was a lie that was put into that decision, or actually into the head note on that decision. Head notes have no legal status. By John Chandler Bancroft Davis, who was a former railroad president. Keep in mind, this was a case where the railroads were suing, saying, we have rights under the 14th Amendment because we're persons. Because the 14th Amendment says all persons have equal rights under the law. It doesn't say all natural persons, and corporations are corporate persons. I mean, you have to have some personhood status in order to pay taxes, own property, sue and be sued, things like that. So what I point out in the article today, and I think it's a pretty important thing to point out, is that moments of crises, moments of great crisis, are also historically, in the history of the United States, and I'm limiting this historical perspective to our country, but I believe that you can find that these are true of they're certainly true of the European countries in the last century and a half. That moments of crisis are also moments of pregnant with potential for great progressive leaps forward. 77 years ago, we ended World War II. Almost 80 years ago. 80 years before that was the end of the Civil War. 80 years before that was the end of the American Revolution. It's like every 80 years we go through another one of these horrible economic recessions or depressions followed by a worldwide war, or at least a major war. And right now you've got both China and Russia pushing as hard as they can to have a world war, in my opinion. And you've got Republicans pushing as hard as they can to throw the United States and the world into a depression. I mean, they have come right out and said, if you elect us, we will shut down the U.S. federal government and throw the government into a debt crisis, which will upset bond markets around the world and throw the whole planet into a depression. This is their vote for us argument, if you can believe it. So what I'm saying in this op-ed today, just to summarize it, because it's a fairly long piece, it's got a lot of quotes in it. And I think you'll find it fascinating. It's titled, Could Today's Crises Help America Reject Corporate Personhood? That's the headline over at HartmannReport.com today. But the bottom line of what I'm saying is that these moments of crisis are the moments that we can make big change, and we need to be ready, and we need to be ready with an argument for reversing corporate personhood. And I lay that argument out in the article. So I think it's pretty important stuff. With regard to inflation, as I mentioned, inflation looks like, from the GDP numbers today, now the economy is growing, but inflation seems to be down. These are not the official inflation numbers. These are the precursor to official inflation numbers that I shared with you a few minutes ago. And we won't see the inflation numbers for another couple of weeks. But hey, this is a good sign. Meanwhile, the Republicans are, as Jim Tankersley and Emily Cochran write over at the New York Times today, riding a wave of anger over inflation. And their answer? How they're going to solve inflation? Well, the Fed is trying to throw us into a recession by throwing people out of work. The Republicans want to throw us into a recession to kill inflation by laying off government workers. They want to shut down the government. And yeah, it will stop inflation because it'll throw us into a depression. I think, stopping inflation in a more rational idea is a better one. But in fact, they note in the New York Times that the Republicans, quote, have pledged to reduce government spending and to make permanent parts of the 2017 Republican tax cuts. They've vowed to repeal the corporate tax increases that Biden signed into law in August while gutting funding for the Internal Revenue Service. The Republicans want to gut funding for the IRS, which was given more money to help the U.S. go after high-earning and corporate tax cheats. So here you have the Republican Party officially on the side of the tax cheats. This is what happens when you have corporate personhood, right? Few economists, they note in the New York Times, few economists on either end of the ideological spectrum expect the Republican Party's proposals to meaningfully reduce inflation, including their tax cuts on high earners and businesses. They say these could actually make price pressures worse by pumping more money into the economy. But, this is what the Republicans are going to do, and they're threatening to crash the economy. In a nationwide deluge of campaign ads and public remarks, they note, Republicans have pinned much of their inflation-fighting hopes on halting a stimulus spending spree that began under Donald Trump, but has largely ended. Mr. Biden has shown little desire to pass further stimulus legislation at a time of rapid price growth. In other words, the Republicans are fighting against themselves, right? They're saying, oh, yeah, what Trump did stimulating the economy in 2020, and yeah, we had some more of that stimulus in 2021. That's terrible, and that's causing inflation. We should do away with all of it. Well, we've already done away with all of it. Child tax credit is gone. The $1,600 checks in your bank account, they're gone. All that stuff is history. So what are the Republicans trying to do now? Well, let's just cause a depression. Brilliant strategy.